Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into it, drilling down into the blueprint of human connection itself. We're analyzing Chapter 5, Social Interaction, from what is really the definitive text, interaction design, beyond human-computer interaction.
Right, and our mission for this deep dive is to use this chapter as a kind of roadmap. We really want to understand the fundamental models, the guidelines that tell us how to design better social technologies.
The very tools that shape how we communicate.
Exactly. How we collaborate, how we connect, whether we're in the same room or, all the way across the globe.
Exactly. So this is all about explaining what being social really means, detailing those basic social mechanisms we use every single day, and defining these big concepts like social presence.
And of course, mapping out how technology from social media to remote work has just completely reshaped our lives.
It's an unavoidable truth, isn't it? We're social creatures.
We are. Our whole lives are built on this constant interaction, keeping each other in the loop about projects, events, or just the little things.
And even though face-to-face is still so important, the scale of digital connection now is it's astounding. We're talking about adults having, on average, hundreds of friends on Facebook.
And for professionals, it's often over 1,000 connections on a platform like LinkedIn.
So technology isn't just an add-on anymore. It's really part of the social fabric.
And that has totally changed how we work. I mean, this whole toolkit of social computing, things like Slack, Trello, Google Docs, it's made flexible, remote work
The norm.
not just possible, but yeah, the absolute standard. And this shift, it raises some really big questions for designers.
Right, which is the key question the chapter poses. Have the old rules, the conversational etiquette we've built up over thousands of years face-to-face, have they actually carried over to the online world?
Or have we just had to invent a completely new set of rules for how to behave online?
We see that conflict all the time, even in something as simple as coordinating an activity.
Oh, absolutely. Think about trying to organize a dinner. You're jumping between modes, texting one person, a group chat with others, maybe a quick call. It just multiplies the conversations everywhere.
And it creates so much confusion.
And some fascinating new behaviors. The chapter talks about teenagers who micro-coordinate everything.
Right, waiting until the very last second to commit.
Exactly, because they're waiting to see if a better offer comes through in another chat. It's technology actually driving social indecision.
But this push for convenience, it seems to have a real social cost.
It does. Sherry Turkle's research points to this, to the negative side of constantly checking our phones. A lot of people prefer texting because it's easier. It requires less effort than a real-time call.
But what do we lose?
We risk losing those spontaneous opportunities to learn empathy,
Right.
If we're always retreating into these easy, comfortable digital bubbles.
That's a huge trade-off. Convenience for social depth.
Yeah.
But not all tech isolates us, right?
No, not at all. You can look at shared devices, like a smart speaker in a house. You put an Amazon Echo on the kitchen counter, and suddenly it's a shared object.
It affords that joint ownership.
Precisely. Everyone can use it together to play a game or look something up. It encourages a kind of interaction that your personal phone just doesn't.
You can really see the difference when you compare it, that spontaneous chat versus premeditated digital stuff.
Oh, it's night and day. Face-to-face is unpredictable. It's rich with all these nonverbal cues, the shared laugh, the eye contact, the body language.
Whereas texting is all premeditated. You can sit there and edit your message over and over.
Exactly. And we try to use emoticons to make up for that missing warmth. But let's be honest, a little yellow smiley face is never going to be a real substitute for a genuine smile or, a shared wink.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting for me. The actual mechanics of conversation. Understanding this stuff is so crucial if you're designing, say, a chatbot or a voice assistant.
It really is, because conversation isn't random. It's this highly skilled collaborative achievement. It's like a jazz ensemble where everyone just knows the cues.
And there's a structure to it.
A very clear structure. Face-to-face chats have a clear beginning, hi there, how's it going? And they have a definite end. It's often multi-stage.
What do you mean?
Well, someone might give an implicit cue, like checking their watch, or an explicit one, okay, I have to go now, and that's followed by the whole farewell ritual, the goodbye, see you later.
But online, a lot of that just vanishes. Phone calls still kind of keep that structure, but in a chat window.
People just jump right in. They often skip the hello entirely, and they stop abruptly, as if the conversation is just paused. not ended.
And this informality is now the professional standard, too.
Absolutely. There was that Boomerang study on email reply rates, which is fascinating. It showed that informal openings like hey or hi got much higher reply rates, around 62 to 64%.
Way more than the formal stuff like dear or greetings.
Right. It just shows we value that digital sincerity. We want to feel like we're talking to a real person.
That makes total sense.
And the data on sign-offs was even clearer. The most popular one, just the word thanks, got the highest response rate of all, 66%. A simple thank you goes a long way.
So if it's also collaborative, how do we keep from just talking over each other all the time?
Well, it's governed by these almost invisible rules. The chapter summarizes the 3 basic turn-taking rules. First, the current speaker can choose the next one, maybe by asking a question.
Okay.
Second, if no one's chosen, another person can just decide to jump in. And third, if nobody does, the current speaker just keeps going.
And we coordinate this with really subtle cues, right?
Subtle, lowering your voice, using phrases like, you know what I mean. We also use back channeling those little uh-huh or yeahs, just to show we're still listening. And then, of course, there's body language, gaze, all of that.
And the structure is also built on something called adjacency pairs. This is a brilliant concept.
It really is.
It's the idea that utterances come in pairs, where the first part creates a really strong expectation for the second. Like a question demands an answer. A request demands a response.
It's the engine of conversational flow. But sometimes that engine breaks down.
Right, and then we need a repair mechanism.
Exactly. If a listener looks confused, the speaker will repeat themselves, maybe with stronger intonation or exaggerated gestures. The example in the book is great. Someone trying to give cinema directions who ends up, wildly drawing in the air to clarify.
And as listeners, we signal that confusion immediately. A little huh or what?
Right, and a puzzled look. But online, you can't do that. You don't have those visual cues.
So repair has to be much more explicit.
It does. In an email or text, you have to literally ask, sorry, did you mean Tuesday the 5th or Wednesday the 6th? Or you send a gentle nudge for a message that didn't get a reply.
And social norms have totally changed around this. Double texting used to be seen as desperate or something.
And now it's just an acceptable reminder. And we have to deal with the ambiguity of the ellipsis, those 3 dots. The sender is often just being vague, and it puts all the work on the receiver to figure out what they actually mean.
Okay, let's shift gears to connecting at a distance. When we first tried to build these media spaces, the technology really struggled to feel natural.
It really did. Take the early video window system. It was this huge projection, like 3 by 5 feet, connecting 2 lounge areas 50 miles apart.
And what did they find?
What's so fascinating is that while the conversations were pretty normal, people spoke louder, and they were constantly talking about the technology itself. How do I look on camera? The tech just demanded its own attention.
Today, that accessibility problem is solved. We have cheap webcams, Zoom is everywhere. We even have effects that enlarge whoever is speaking.
But now the cutting edge is these high-end telepresence rooms. They use eye tracking, directional audio, all to increase the feeling of telepresence, that deep sense of actually being there when you're physically remote.
And then there are the robots.
Ah, yes. The Beam Plus telepresence robot. It's a 5-foot-tall wheeled base with a screen for a head. It sounds like science fiction.
But the reality is a bit messier.
A lot messier. The story in the chapter about the PhD student attending a conference remotely with one is it's perfect.
It's hilarious. She had to stay up all night because of the time difference. She couldn't get the robot to push the elevator button correctly.
And then at one point, her volume accidentally went to maximum and just blasted the whole room.
And you can't forget the core technical problem.
Right. The Wi-Fi dipped, and her image just broke up into these big, blocky pixels. The book describes it perfectly. She looked like a digital David Bowie. It just shows how far we still have to go.
So if presence is the goal, we need to be clear on our terms. There's telepresence, which is feeling like you're in a real physical place.
Yeah, and then there's social presence, which is the feeling of being with a real person, but in a totally virtual world.
Yeah.
Think about VR, like in Facebook Spaces, where you interact as cartoon avatars.
That desire for closeness brings us to mimicry.
Yes, where we unconsciously copy each other's facial expressions or gestures to build empathy.
And researchers actually tried to engineer this.
They have. They built a system called FaceShare. It uses 3D modeling to artificially superimpose a pseudo-smile onto your video feed when the other person smiles.
And did it work?
Apparently, it made the interactions feel smoother. A little creepy, but smoother.
Okay, so now let's go from connecting at a distance to supporting people in the same space. This is what we call co-presence.
Right. And here, technology like smart boards or digital tables has to help coordination and awareness, but without being intrusive.
In physical coordination, we use a mix of things.
A whole mix. Verbal commands like down a bit to the left when you're moving a piano, but also those nonverbal cues, the nods, the winks.
And even formal gestures like a conductor with a baton or the person guiding a plane on the tarmac. Those physical objects act as external props to focus everyone's attention.
And all of this relies on awareness, just knowing what's going on around you. The chapter breaks it into two types.
The first being peripheral awareness.
Right, that's just maintaining a general sense of your surroundings without focusing on them, noticing who just left the party or sensing that the mood in the room has shifted,
And the second is situational awareness.
which is much more critical, especially in high-stakes jobs like air traffic control. It's really understanding how what's happening now is going to affect the future.
You can see the power of peripheral awareness in close-knit teams. The classic study of the London Underground controllers is a perfect example.
It is. One controller, controller B, just overheard another one, controller A, talking to a train driver. And just from that little auditory cue, he inferred that a service disruption was about to happen. He started making passenger announcements before controller A even had a chance to tell him what was going on.
Wow.
That's why shareable interfaces like multi-touch tables are so interesting. The example of the augmented reality sandbox is great. Kids are moving real sand, and the system overlays a virtual landscape onto it.
And it just naturally encourages them to collaborate. You get these creative discussions, like a kid saying, hey, let's turn this land into sea.
And the research also shows that how we contribute to these shared spaces matters for equality.
Yeah, that study was fascinating. Using actual physical tokens to add content to a tabletop led to more equitable participation than just using a digital keyboard.
It helped the Shire members contribute more because the action was more tangible, less intimidating.
Designers have also played with giving ambient feedback.
Right, like the Reflect table. It used embedded mics and colored LEDs to show in real time who was talking the most. The more you talked, the more lights lit up in your area.
And what were the results?
A bit mixed. The people who talked a lot did reduce their speaking time, but the quiet people didn't necessarily talk more. It really depended on whether the group actually cared about the goal of equal contribution.
This all leads to a really important design principle: social translucence.
Which is just the idea of making participants and their activities visible to each other. An early example was the Babbel chat room, which visualized conversations as marbles moving towards the center of a circle. You could see who was active.
And today we see this in tools like Sokoko, the online office platform.
Exactly. It uses a literal floor plan of an office as its interface. You can see who's in what room, who's meeting with whom. It lets remote workers pop in on each other, trying to replicate that feeling of just being in the same building.
And finally, there's tech designed purely to be an icebreaker.
Yes, like the Opinionizer system. It was a big public display where people could share their opinions anonymously. This created what the researchers called a honeypot effect.
A sociable buzz.
A buzz that signaled to everyone that this was a place where it was okay to talk to strangers, but contrast that with the break time barometer.
The clock that showed how many people were in the common room.
Yeah, and interestingly, sometimes it led people to avoid their colleagues. If the room looked too busy, they'd just stay away. So technology can bring us together, or it can help us stay apart.
Okay, let's scale this all the way up to social engagement.
Which is all about voluntary, unpaid participation, usually online, that supports pro-social behavior. A great example is Good Gym, which connects runners with older people who are isolated so they can help with chores during their run.
And social media can amplify this to a massive viral scale.
Oh, absolutely. The chapter brings up the epic Twitter battle between Ellen DeGeneres' Oscar selfie.
And Carter Wilkerson's quest for free Wendy's chicken nuggets.
Exactly. He ended up breaking the retweet record with 3.5 million, and he used all that attention to raise money for charity, which Wendy's then matched. It's this massive collaborative engagement for a good cause.
But on a more serious note, this immediacy creates digital volunteers.
People who use platforms like Twitter to provide critical situational awareness during a crisis. We see it with natural disasters, accidents. A FEMA chief even said he got better, faster information from Twitter during a gas explosion than from his own official channels.
But that speed is a double-edged sword, isn't it?
It's the biggest problem. Citizen-led information is incredibly fast, but its reliability is a huge question mark. It can fuel rumors, spread old or incorrect information, and make it almost impossible to know what's fact and what's hearsay in those first critical moments.
So to try and summarize everything we've unpacked here,
Yeah.
social interaction is it's central to being human.
It is. And the basic mechanisms, conversation, coordination, awareness, they're the same, but they have to fundamentally change and evolve when we move them into these digital or remote spaces.
There's no question social media has just completely altered the scale and speed of how we manage all our connections.
I think the continuous effort in interaction design is just this. Trying to use technology to replicate the nuance, the spontaneity, and the empathy of a real face-to-face conversation.
And that, I think, leads us to the ultimate question the chapter leaves you with, especially when you think about AI. We can now create a chatbot from the texts and posts of a loved one who has passed away.
Yeah.
So is it ethically or socially okay to talk to a chatbot based on a dead person, especially if they never gave their consent for this kind of digital resurrection? What does that kind of interaction mean for our own empathy and for how we grieve when the conversation is by its very nature one-sided? Something to think about as you navigate your own very connected world.